Good afternoon. We are ready for this. Well, as you know, GOED has been producing for a few years now a somewhat comprehensive report on the ingredient market for omega-3 oils. This is, I believe, the fourth year we have produced this. If you have never seen the report, you are cordially invited to download it from the GOED website and take a look at that. So this is a report that we do normally a few months after the fact. The data that I'm going to present today is going to correspond to what we think happened in 2016. I'm going to give you a few insights of what we are seeing happening in 2017 and in the next 2 years. And I'm going to point out a few things that I think are going to be fairly interesting to keep a look for in the years to come. So what happened in 2016? I actually think that the total volume globally of omega-3 ingredients grew, or maybe about 2.5%. So it is now at 88,000 metric tons or so. And you cannot imagine how relieved I am to say this. The last 2 years, when I give exactly the same talk, it has been somewhat more depressing. Not my fault. I'm glad that things are looking better, and I think that they're going to keep looking better for at least the foreseeable future. From the point of view of value, also we have seen a growth of about 2.4%. So the value of the market in 2016 was approximately $1.9 billion US dollars. This is for ingredients, of course. Finished products is much higher figures than that. Again, you cannot imagine how relieved I am to say this. Because if you remember the same talk last year, if you ever saw one of my talks last year, basically the market was flat in volume, and prices were going down very enthusiastically, particularly in some of the most valuable ingredients, concentrates and algae oils and so on. So the value dropped in 2015, possibly 10%, and both volume and value dropped in 2014. So this is good news. This is looking better. It comes as no surprise, of course, as the major market is still the US, fueled by a very large very large supplement market. So close to 30,000 metric tons a year in ingredients, followed by Europe and followed by China. And then everything else is growing fairly fast, is much smaller than that. From the point of view of value, the US is, of course, still the largest, much larger than anybody else. And then you have China and you have Europe, which are fairly close in value by now. In spite of the differences in volume, it's because China has a larger formula market and the ingredients are more expensive in there. So the value of the Chinese market is comparatively larger if you compare with Europe. Now, this is something that hasn't changed at all, actually. This is how volume has been changing in each one of the markets. If you take a look at the larger, more established markets, Europe, Australia, the US, they're fairly flat. The US actually is growing for the first time in a long time, but it's not growing much. I mean, it's 40 extra metric tons a year out of 30,000. This is flat. Europe is contracting, and most of the growth is something that we are seeing in the emerging markets, particularly in Asia. Smaller volumes in many cases. So, if you have ever seen me give this talk before, you know that I don't normally forecast anything. It's because you can be so wrong, and people can make bad decisions based on what I say. So, but I have been creating these reports every single year for 4 years now, and every single time I create one new report, I take the old report, I use it to forecast what I think happened in the next year, and I compare that with my numbers for that year. And after all this time, the numbers seem to coincide. So I think that you shouldn't believe any single one of my forecasts for, I don't know how much concentrate at 80% is growing in Europe You shouldn't believe something like that. But if you aggregate the numbers for big geographies, for global demand and so on, it's possibly not all that bad. So based on that, I actually think that we're going to be seeing growth in volume picking up a little bit. And I think that from here to 2019, we're going to be seeing, on average, in volume, a growth of 4.4%. So what is going on that's interesting these days? What have we seen in 2016 that should be mentioned? The first thing, and this is nothing new actually, supplement users in Europe, in the US, they have been moving away from refined oils, 30% type oils, and going to concentrates. So if you just focus for a moment on concentrates and refined oils, if you put both of them together, the US has been contracting at 1.5%. Europe has been contracting at 2.6%. China is growing, of course, and globally things are growing because just fueled by these emerging markets. But let's put these numbers into context because, you know, when you move from a refined oil to a concentrate, you're also contracting the volume. So are we getting more EPA and DHA? Or are we getting the same? What's going on in there? Turns out that in the US, the amount of EPA and DHA being delivered in supplements by refined oils and concentrates has gone up very little, 1.2%. In Europe, down 0.4%. You know these numbers are not too precise. I think that is a fair thing to say. It is flat. And China, of course, is growing, and globally, the amount of EPA and DHA delivered by these two, the most common oils, is growing up at 4% or so a year. So it's things are not quite as bad as you could think sometimes. We are making some progress. More people are getting their oils. As I mentioned, I expect the demand in volume to be growing at about 4.4% on average in the next 3 years. But the demand of EPA and DHA, that is growing much faster than that. Again, because we're moving into concentrates. I don't know for how long I can trust this prediction, because as you well know, eventually, the growth in supplements, I mean, there's only so much refined that you can replace with supplements. But I imagine that for a couple of years or so, this is not an entirely bad prediction. Pharmaceuticals in the US. Pharmaceuticals in the US are a complicated situation. We have two things going on. Vascepa is growing fairly fast at 40% a year. This is the number of standardized prescriptions, meaning the number of monthly prescriptions being sold in the US. And if you take a look at that as a total, it's fairly flat. It's actually growing at about 2% or so. It's better than in previous years, and it's going to pick up because Vascepa is actually taking off quite enthusiastically. At the same time, the volume of Lovasa and generics combined is going down, possibly at about 8% a year. That will eventually have to slow down. How about 2018? Because you see, I just made a prediction. There are things that could completely derail my predictions, and it should possibly confess the things that we should be looking forward to that could prove me a liar in front of all of you. So, I actually think that pharmaceuticals in the US, now that Vascepa is picking up in volume enthusiastically, eventually that's going to pick up and we're going to be seeing growth. I think that in the US we're going to be seeing a growth in volume of about 7% a year in 2018. Things could go wrong in there, okay? I actually think that Vascepa will be selling more volume than Lovasa and generics at the rate we're going, or sometime next year. But we're expecting two large interventional trials in here. We have the VITAL study, which is a primary prevention study on cancer and cardiovascular disease. And I don't know how that's going to turn out. We could see a positive result. We could see a neutral result, or we can see a protective effect that is not statistically significant. And if that happens, that could affect the market very enthusiastically. We also have the REDUCE trial coming. This is a trial for Vascepa, trying to see whether Vascepa does reduce the number of cardiovascular events. We know that it reduces triglycerides, but events, we're not entirely sure. So whatever happens with these two studies have a potential of affecting the market very enthusiastically. And the third thing that I think is going on that we should be watching out for is, in China, there are 9 candidate drugs at different places in the approval process. One of these days, we're going to see one of them approved, and that is going to completely change the equation, not only because it's going to introduce the first pharmaceutical in China, but because it may actually renew or revive a little bit the interest in the supplement market. So this is something to watch, and they wouldn't be surprised if we see the first approval this year or next. And that, I believe, is the quickest update I can give you of what we think is going on at the moment. Thank you for being here.